The morning sun beat down on Fort Redstone's advanced marksmanship range with the kind of intensity that made mirages dance above the distant target berms. Corporal Isla Thorne stood at the far end of the observation deck, her fingers wrapped loosely around a lukewarm cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. The shooting line stretched before her like a stage, and today's performance was not going well. General Vincent Aldridge, a man whose chest displayed enough ribbons to tell a dozen stories of valor, squinted downrange through his spotting scope and muttered something that made his aides stiffen. 13 shots, 13 misses. The paper targets at 800 yards remained mockingly pristine, their centers untouched by the rounds that had sailed wide or fallen short. Isla watched without judgment, her hazel eyes tracking the subtle tells that most observers missed. The general's breathing was rushed, his triggers squeezed jerky with mounting frustration. She had seen it countless times before, that moment when a shooter's mind became their own worst enemy. Skill evaporated under the weight of expectation, replaced by tension that turned muscle memory into guesswork. Around her, 24 soldiers from various units had gathered for what was supposed to be an exhibition of expert marksmanship. Instead, they were witnessing something far more human. Major Kent Broderick stood with arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral as he watched his commanding officer struggle. Sergeant Liam Voss whispered something to the specialist beside him, both men shifting their weight uncomfortably. Before we continue with what happened next, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have family who served or military bases near your hometown. The general stepped back from his rifle, a custom Remington that probably cost more than Isla's entire yearly salary. He removed his shooting glasses and pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes. The gesture carried the weight of a man who had once been legendary for his marksmanship, back when he spent more time in the field than behind a desk. Age and administrative duties had not stolen his skill entirely, but they had dulled the edge that separated good from exceptional. Isla took a sip of her cold coffee and said nothing. She had learned long ago that invisibility was a kind of armor. At 5'6", with an unremarkable build and a face people forgot 5 minutes after meeting her, she had perfected the art of fading into backgrounds. Her service record was a patchwork of redacted operations and classified deployments, the kind of file that raised questions she was not permitted to answer. The range officer, Captain Felix Drummond, approached the general with the careful gait of someone navigating a minefield. He carried a clipboard and wore the expression of a man hoping to be anywhere else. The two spoke in low tones, their words lost beneath the wind that swept across the open range, carrying with it the scent of gun oil and dried grass. Isla knew what was being discussed without hearing a word. The demonstration was meant to showcase Fort Redstone's training program to a visiting delegation of Allied officers who would arrive within the hour. The schedule had been planned down to the minute, a carefully choreographed display of American military precision. Except precision was currently in short supply. She glanced at the distant targets, their white faces stark against the brown hillside behind them. 800 yards was not particularly challenging for someone with proper training, but the general was fighting demons that had nothing to do with distance or windage. He was fighting the ghost of who he used to be, and that was a battle no amount of medals could help win. Specialist Torres, a young woman with nervous energy radiating from every movement, edged closer to where Isla stood. She had been assigned to ammunition detail and seemed grateful for any excuse to avoid the tension on the firing line. Torres glanced at Isla, started to speak, then apparently thought better of it and looked away. The general returned to his position, his jaw set with grim determination. He chambered another round, the metallic click carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the range. Every observer seemed to hold their breath, hoping this would be the shot that broke the streak that restored order to a morning that had gone badly off script. The 14th shot cracked across the range, and Isla watched the general's shoulders drop even before Captain Drummond called out the miss. The bullet had sailed high and right, victim to a flinch that even the most disciplined shooter could develop when their confidence began to crumble. The general's aide, Lieutenant Nora Castellan, made a notation on her tablet with movements so precise they bordered on mechanical. Isla shifted her weight and considered the physics of what she was witnessing. The wind was gusting from the west at approximately 12 miles per hour, strong enough to drift around, but not enough to explain the general's consistent misses. The problem was not external. It was the subtle tremor in his hands, the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid, the mental spiral that turned every miss into prophecy for the next. Major Broderick moved closer to the firing line, his boots crunching on the gravel that lined the observation deck. He was a career infantry officer with a reputation for bluntness, and Isla could see him calculating whether intervention would help or humiliate. The muscles in his jaw worked as he ground his teeth, watching a man he respected struggle in front of subordinates who would remember this morning for years. Sergeant Voss leaned toward Corporal Hayes, a stocky man with sunburned forearms, and whispered something that made Hayes smirk before catching himself. The ripple of awkwardness spread through the gathered soldiers like a wave. No one wanted to witness a superior officer's failure, yet no one could look away. It was human nature, that compulsion to watch things fall apart even as you wish they would not. The general reloaded with movements that had become automatic over decades of service. 15. The number hung in the air like an accusation. 15 attempts at a shot that he could have made blindfolded 20 years ago, back when he was running reconnaissance missions in places the Army still would not officially acknowledge. Back when his hands were steady and his mind was not cluttered with budget meetings and political considerations. Isla took another sip of her forgotten coffee, grimacing at the bitter cold liquid. She understood what was happening to the general more intimately than anyone present could guess. She had seen elite operators fall apart under pressure, watched snipers with confirmed kills in the triple digits suddenly unable to hit a target at 200 yards. The mind was a fragile instrument, and sometimes it simply decided to stop cooperating. Captain Drummond checked his watch with increasing frequency, his concern no longer limited to the general's performance. The visiting delegation would arrive in 43 minutes, and the demonstration range still needed to be reset, the targets replaced, the brass collected. The schedule was disintegrating, and with it, the carefully planned impression Fort Redstone had hoped to make. Specialist Torres moved to collect empty magazines, her hands shaking slightly as she passed within 10 feet of the general. Isla noticed the young woman's anxiety and recognized it as the nervousness of someone new enough to the service that watching leadership struggle felt like watching a natural law being violated. Torres probably still believed that enough rank and experience made people invulnerable to ordinary human weakness. The 15th shot rang out, and this time Isla saw the target paper shiver. A hit, but so far from center that it barely counted as improvement. The general's exhale was audible even from where Isla stood, a sound of relief mixed with continued frustration. 1 out of 15 was not the ratio of a marksman. It was the ratio of someone guessing, hoping, praying for luck. Lieutenant Castellan's fingers flew across her tablet, likely composing the diplomatic message that would explain to the visiting delegation why the demonstration was running behind schedule. Her expression remained professionally blank, but Isla caught the tension in her shoulders, the way she held her neck too stiffly. Everyone was feeling the pressure now, the weight of a morning that had gone wrong in ways that could not be easily corrected. Major Broderick finally stepped forward, closing the distance to the general with the careful approach of someone who understood the delicacy of the situation. He spoke quietly, his words meant only for the general's ears, and Isla watched the older man's face cycle through emotions too quickly to catalog. Pride warred with practicality, stubbornness battled with reason. The wind picked up, carrying with it dust that made several observers turn their faces away. Isla did not flinch. She had spent enough time in worse conditions that a little grit in the air was barely noticeable. Her eyes remained on the general, on the way his grip on the rifle had become white-knuckled, on the set of his jaw that suggested he was not ready to surrender this fight. The general stepped back from the firing line, and removed his shooting glasses with deliberate slowness, as if the simple act required all his remaining composure. Major Broderick stood beside him now, their conversation continuing in tones too low for most to hear, but Isla caught fragments carried on the capricious wind. Reset the range. Reschedule. Alternative demonstration. Each phrase was a small surrender, an acknowledgement that perfection had slipped beyond reach. Then the general's voice rose, not quite a shout, but loud enough to silence every private conversation on the observation deck. He turned to face the assembled soldiers, his weathered face flushed from sun and frustration, and his words carried the edge of a challenge born from wounded pride. Any snipers left in this army, or have we all gotten soft behind desks and computer screens? The question hung in the air like smoke. Isla felt rather than saw the ripple of reaction move through the gathered personnel. Several of the more experienced marksmen shifted their weight, their eyes darting to their neighbors, as if checking to see who might volunteer for what could easily become public humiliation. Sergeant Voss stared at his boots. Corporal Hayes suddenly found the distant mountains fascinating. No one wanted to be the soldier who stepped forward only to fail in front of a frustrated general. Lieutenant Castellan's fingers had frozen over her tablet, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal uncertainty. Captain Drummond opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly calculating whether he should intervene or let the moment play out. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy, broken only by the wind and the distant call of a hawk circling somewhere beyond the target berms. Isla took a final sip of her cold coffee and set the cup down on the wooden railing that bordered the observation deck. The ceramic made a soft sound against the weathered wood, barely noticeable, yet somehow loud in the tense quiet. She felt the weight of her own history pressing against her ribs, all those classified operations and redacted missions that had taught her exactly what she was capable of. The instinct to remain invisible warred with something else, something that whispered about responsibility and opportunity. Specialist Torres had stopped moving entirely, frozen in place with an ammunition can still clutched in both hands. Her eyes were wide, watching the drama unfold with the intensity of someone witnessing something they would tell stories about for years. Around her, other junior enlisted personnel wore similar expressions, caught between fascination and secondhand anxiety. The general's challenge had not been idle words. Isla could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his hand remained near his holstered sidearm, as if ready to defend his question with action, if necessary. He was a man who had spent 40 years in uniform, who had earned his rank through competence and courage, and watching his own skills fail him had stripped away the diplomatic veneer that peacetime service encouraged. This was the general from 2 decades ago, raw and unfiltered, demanding excellence because he had once embodied it. Major Broderick glanced around the assembled group, his gaze sweeping across faces that carefully avoided eye contact. Isla watched his jaw tighten, watched him draw breath to say something that might defuse the situation or redirect it, but he hesitated. Perhaps he too sensed that this moment needed to play out, that sometimes the best leadership was knowing when to step aside. The wind gusted again, stronger this time, and Isla felt it pull at her uniform blouse, felt it whisper across her skin with the familiar touch of 1,000 firing ranges in a dozen countries. She thought about the last time she had held a rifle, for months ago in a place she could not name, engaging targets at distances that would sound like exaggeration if she spoke them aloud. She thought about the muscle memory that never really faded, the way her body still knew the rhythms of breathing and trigger squeeze, even when her conscious mind was occupied elsewhere. Corporal Hayes cleared his throat, a sound that might have been the prelude to volunteering, but then his nerve failed and the moment passed. Sergeant Voss looked like he might be calculating odds, weighing the risk of failure against the potential glory of success, but he too remained rooted in place. These were good soldiers, competent marksmen, but none of them wanted to gamble their reputation on a morning that had already proven treacherous. Isla pushed away from the railing and felt her feet begin to move before her mind had fully committed to the decision. It was instinct more than choice, Muscle memory of a different kind, the automatic response of someone who had spent years walking toward danger while others walked away. She was aware of heads turning, of eyes tracking her movement with surprise and confusion, but the observations felt distant, muted, as if happening to someone else. Isla's boots made soft sounds against the gravel as she walked toward the firing line, each step measured and unhurried. She was aware of the stairs following her movement, could feel the weight of confusion and skepticism pressing against her back like a physical force. Someone behind her, she thought it might be Corporal Hayes, made a sound that could have been a laugh or a cough, quickly stifled, but not quickly enough. The general turned toward her, his expression cycling through surprise and something that might have been irritation. His eyes swept over her small frame, her unremarkable presence, and Isla could see the calculations happening behind his weathered face. She was nobody he recognized, nobody whose name appeared on any roster of competitive shooters or distinguished marksmen. Just another junior enlisted soldier with the audacity to answer a challenge clearly meant for more experienced personnel. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard without shouting. "I can try if you are willing." Major Broderick's eyebrows rose fractionally, and he exchanged a glance with Captain Drummond that spoke volumes without words. Lieutenant Castellan had stopped typing entirely, her tablet forgotten as she watched this unexpected development. Sergeant Voss leaned toward Hayes again, their whispered conversation punctuated by barely concealed skepticism that Isla pretended not to notice. The general studied her for a long moment, his jaw working as if chewing on words he had decided not to speak. Islam met his gaze steadily, without challenge or deference, simply waiting for his decision. She had learned long ago that the worst thing you could do in moments like this was to appear eager or desperate. Confidence was a language spoken through posture and patience, not through words. "Your name?" "Corporal," the general said finally, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was already regretting this detour from his frustration. "Thorn, sir. Isla Torne." She did not elaborate, did not offer her unit assignment or her specialty, because those details would raise questions she was not authorized to answer. Her service record was a maze of classifications and compartmentalized operations that even most officers with appropriate clearance found confusing. The general glanced at Major Broderick, who shrugged with a gesture that said they had nothing to lose beyond pride they had already spent. The morning was ruined anyway, the demonstration already a disaster, and what was one more miss added to the growing tally. At least it would shift attention away from the general's own failures, redistribute the embarrassment across a wider base. "Very well, Corporal Thorn," the general said, stepping aside with a sweep of his arm that granted her access to the firing line. "Show us what you have." Islam moved to the rifle, the same custom Remington that had betrayed its owner through 15 attempts. She did not touch it immediately, instead taking a moment to assess the setup, to read the wind flags downrange and feel the sun's angle against her face. The morning had warmed considerably since she had first arrived, and heat shimmer was beginning to dance above the distant berms, adding another variable to an already complex equation. Behind her, she heard Specialist Torres whisper something about this being crazy, heard the young woman's voice carry the mixture of second-hand anxiety and morbid curiosity that came from watching someone step into the spotlight unprepared. Except Isla was not unprepared. She was simply unknown, and those were very different conditions. She picked up the rifle with hands that knew its weight and balance before conscious thought could catalog the details. The stock settled against her shoulder with the familiar comfort of 1,000 previous weapons, each one different, but all of them fundamentally the same. Metal and wood and physics, all waiting to be directed by someone who understood their nature. Corporal Hayes made that sound again, the one that was not quite a laugh, and muttered something about this being entertaining at least. Sergeant Voss shushed him, but without much conviction, clearly thinking similar thoughts. The general consensus among the observers seemed to be that they were about to witness either spectacular failure or mediocre success, neither of which would salvage the morning, but at least the latter might provide some distraction. Isla ignored them all. She had learned that skill in places where distraction meant death, where the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure often came down to the ability to create silence inside your own head, even when the world around you is chaos. She checked the chamber, confirmed the magazine, and settled into a shooting position that felt as natural as breathing. Isla's breathing slowed automatically, falling into the rhythm that her body had learned through thousands of hours on ranges much less forgiving than this one. She felt her heart rate drop, felt the world narrow to the specific geometry of trajectory and wind and distance. The rifle became an extension of her intention, metal and physics waiting to be directed with precision that most people spent lifetimes trying to achieve. The first shot surprised even her with its immediacy. She had not consciously decided to fire, had simply reached the moment when all variables aligned and her finger completed its smooth press against the trigger. The report echoed across the range, sharp and clean, and she was already cycling the bolt before Captain Drummond's voice called out the result. Center mass, 800 yards. The murmuring behind her changed pitch, skepticism giving way to surprise. Isla did not acknowledge it, did not turn to gauge reactions or seek validation. She was already reading the wind again, feeling how it had shifted fractionally in the seconds since her first shot. The target at 800 yards had been the general's nemesis, but it was barely a warm-up for someone who had engaged hostiles at distances that turned human beings into theoretical concepts. Her second shot followed within 20 seconds of the first, and this time she adjusted for a slight crosswind that was gusting from the northwest. The bullet flew true, punching through paper exactly 2 inches left of her first impact. Captain Drummond's confirmation came with a note of interest that had not been present before, as if he was beginning to reassess what he was witnessing. Major Broderick moved closer to the spotting scope, his earlier posture of polite skepticism replaced by genuine attention. Sergeant Voss had stopped whispering entirely, his mouth slightly open as he watched this unknown corporal make the general's impossible task look routine. Specialist Torres had set down her ammunition can and was staring with the unfiltered amazement of someone watching magic performed in broad daylight. Isla fired her third shot, and then her fourth, each one placed with the mechanical precision of someone who had long ago transcended the need for conscious thought in the process. Muscle memory and mathematical understanding had merged into something that looked like intuition, but was actually the product of training so intensive it had rewired her nervous system. The targets at 800 yards now bore a tight cluster that could be covered with the palm of a hand. The general had moved to stand beside Major Broderick, his earlier frustration temporarily forgotten in the face of what he was observing. His eyes were narrowed, not with anger, but with the calculating assessment of someone who had spent enough time in combat to recognize genuine expertise when he saw it. He glanced at Lieutenant Castellan, who was already pulling up something on her tablet, likely trying to access Isla's service record and finding nothing but redactions and classification markers. Isla shifted her position slightly, adjusting for the increased heat shimmer that was now rising in visible waves from the sun-baked ground. She knew the observers were expecting her to stop at 800 yards, to declare victory over the distance that had defeated the general and leave the demonstration at that. Instead, she turned her attention to the targets at 1,200 yards, paper silhouettes that most shooters would not attempt without extensive preparation and ideal conditions. Behind her, Corporal Hayes made a sound that was definitely not a laugh this time. It carried the edge of someone who had just realized they were watching something well outside normal parameters. Sergeant Voss had taken several steps forward, as if proximity to the firing line might help him understand what was happening. The wind that had been gusting unpredictably seemed to settle, as if nature itself had decided to stop interfering and simply observe. Isla's fifth shot reached out across 1,200 yards of Montana air and found its target with the certainty of gravity. The paper shivered, and Captain Drummond's voice carried a note of disbelief when he confirmed the hit. She fired again and again, each shot a statement written in ballistics and physics. The cluster at 1,200 yards was wider than at 800, but still remarkably tight for the distance and conditions. Lieutenant Castellan had stopped trying to access files and was simply watching now, her professional detachment giving way to the same fascination that had captured everyone else. The general's aide had seen plenty of skilled shooters during her career, but there was something about the efficiency of Isla's movements, the complete lack of wasted motion or hesitation, that suggested capabilities beyond normal training. The eighth shot punched through paper at 1,500 yards, a distance where wind drift and bullet drop became significant factors requiring calculations that many marksmen struggled to perform even with computers and ideal conditions. Isla was working with neither, relying instead on experience accumulated in places where missing meant consequences far worse than embarrassment. The range had fallen into a silence that felt almost sacred, broken only by the rhythmic crack of Isla's rifle and the wind moving through the distant sagebrush. She had reached a state of flow where time seemed to dilate, where each shot existed in its own pocket of possibility before physics carried it downrange. 1,800 yards now, targets that appeared as barely visible specks even through good optics, and still her shots found their marks with consistency that defied explanation. Major Broderick had abandoned all pretense of casual observation and was now actively spotting for her, calling out wind conditions and target confirmations with the intensity of someone who had realized they were witnessing something rare. The general stood beside him, arms crossed over his chest, his expression cycling through emotions too complex to categorize. There was respect there, certainly, but also curiosity and perhaps a touch of wounded pride at how effortlessly this unknown corporal was accomplishing what had humiliated him. Specialist Torres had moved closer without seeming to realize it, drawn forward by the gravitational pull of exceptional performance. She stood beside Corporal Hayes now, both of them watching with the kind of attention usually reserved for religious experiences or natural disasters. Hayes had stopped making any sounds at all, his earlier mockery transformed into something approaching awe. Lieutenant Castellan finally broke away from her tablet and approached the general, leaning close to whisper something that Isla could not hear. The general's eyebrows rose fractionally, and he nodded once before turning his attention back to the firing line. Whatever information the lieutenant had managed to extract from Isla's service record had clearly been limited, but it had been enough to shift his understanding of who was standing at his rifle. Isla fired her 12th shot, placing its center mass on a target at 2,000 yards. The bullet's flight time was long enough that she had already begun breathing for the next shot before Captain Drummond confirmed the hit. The mathematics involved at this distance were complex enough that most shooters would need minutes to calculate, but Isla's brain processed the variables with the speed of someone who had performed these calculations so many times they had become automatic. Sergeant Voss had pulled out his phone and appeared to be taking video, though he kept the device low and tried to remain inconspicuous about it. Isla noticed, but did not care. Let him record. Let them all document this if they wanted. The only thing that mattered was the target, the wind, the rifle, and the space between heartbeats where perfect shots lived. The wind shifted again, a more dramatic change this time, and Isla paused for the first time since she had begun shooting. She watched the flags downrange, read the patterns in how the heat shimmer moved across the landscape, and made adjustments to her position and aim that would have been invisible to anyone not trained to notice such subtleties. This was where art met science, where accumulated experience allowed for intuitive leaps that looked like magic, but were actually deep pattern recognition. Major Broderick leaned toward the general and said something that made the older man's jaw tighten. Isla caught fragments of their conversation, words like special operations and classified deployment and need to know, and she understood that they were beginning to piece together the outline of who she was even if they could not access the details. The redactions in her file were there for good reasons, protecting not just her, but the operation she had supported and the people she had worked alongside. Her 13th shot flew through the challenging crosswind and struck true, and Captain Drummond's voice had taken on a note of reverence when he called the confirmation. 2,200 yards. The targets at this distance were barely visible even through quality optics, reduced to abstract concepts more than physical objects. Yet Isla continued to find them with accuracy that suggested capabilities far beyond standard military marksmanship training. Corporal Hayes finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. He turned to Sergeant Voss and asked who she was really, and the question hung in the air because nobody present had an answer that was not classified or speculative. Isla Thorne was a ghost, a collection of redacted files and compartmentalized knowledge, and watching her work was like glimpsing something that existed in the spaces between official records. The general moved forward, closing the distance to where Isla lay prone behind his rifle, and she sensed his approach without needing to look. She finished her 14th shot, watched it impact at 2,400 yards, and only then did she pause to acknowledge his presence. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them that needed no words. Recognition, respect, understanding that some skills could not be adequately explained or easily categorized. The general knelt beside Isla with the careful movements of someone who understood he was no longer in charge of this demonstration. His voice, when he spoke, carried none of the frustration that had marked his earlier challenges. "How far can you reach, Corporal?" Isla glanced downrange, past the targets she had already conquered, toward the berms that marked the absolute limit of Fort Redstone's range. 4,000 yards, nearly 2.5 miles. The distance at which bullets became theoretical exercises, where gravity and wind and the Earth's rotation all conspired to turn marksmanship into something approaching alchemy. She had made shots at that distance exactly 3 times in her career, all of them under conditions that remained classified and in service of objectives she would never discuss. "The equipment matters at that range, sir," she said quietly. "This rifle is excellent, but it was not built for extreme distance work. The scope magnification, the ammunition load, the barrel harmonics, all optimized for different parameters." The general nodded slowly, processing this information with the understanding of someone who had once known these details intimately. Major Broderick had moved closer, drawn by the conversation, and his expression suggested he was beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what Isla was implying. Shots at 4,000 yards were the domain of specialized units, the kind that operated in places where official presence would be diplomatically problematic. Lieutenant Castellan appeared at the general's shoulder, her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. "Sir," she said, her voice pitched low enough that only those immediately nearby could hear. "Her file has markings I have not seen before. The clearances required to access her full record are beyond my authorization." The general's eyes never left Isla's face. "I'm beginning to understand that, Lieutenant." He paused, then asked the question that everyone present was thinking. "What unit are you actually assigned to, Corporal Thorne?" Isla met his gaze with the calm of someone who had answered similar questions before and knew exactly how much she could say. "I am currently on administrative assignment, sir, pending reassignment after my last deployment concluded. My permanent unit designation is classified." The answer was not really an answer, but it told the general everything he needed to know. Administrative assignment was often code for operators cooling down after missions that had pushed them to their limits, waiting for their next tasking in positions that kept them busy but not challenged. Isla had been marking time in whatever mundane role Fort Redstone had assigned her, probably something clerical or logistical, staying sharp through her own discipline while official channels processed her next deployment. Sergeant Voss had stopped recording and was now simply staring, his phone hanging forgotten in his hand. Corporal Hayes looked like someone who had just discovered that the janitor in their building was actually a renowned surgeon working incognito. Specialist Torres had tears in her eyes, though Isla doubted the young woman understood why. Sometimes excellence moved people in ways they could not articulate. Captain Drummond approached from the spotting station, his expression caught between professional duty and personal amazement. "General, the visiting delegation will be here in 22 minutes. We need to make a decision about how to proceed with the demonstration." The general straightened, his knees protesting the movement with audible pops that he ignored. His gaze swept across the assembled personnel, lingering on the shocked faces and dropped jaws, before returning to Isla. Show them what 4,000 yards looks like, Corporal. Even if this rifle was not built for it, show us what you can do. Isla hesitated, not from fear of failure, but from professional assessment of probability. The wind was variable now, gusting in patterns that would make compensation difficult. The heat shimmer had intensified, creating optical distortions that would interfere with accurate targeting. The ammunition in the general's rifle was match-grade, but not specialized for extreme long-range work, and the ballistics would be unpredictable past 3,000 yards. But she had worked with worse conditions in places where the stakes were measured in lives rather than pride. She had taken shots that defied reasonable probability because someone's survival depended on her willingness to attempt the impossible. This was just paper targets and reputation, and she had stopped caring about the latter years ago. "I will need 3 shots to calibrate," she said, her voice carrying across the now silent range. "The first 2 will likely miss. The third might connect if conditions cooperate." The general nodded, and there was something in his expression that suggested he understood exactly what she was offering. This was not guaranteed success. This was honest assessment and professional humility, the acknowledgement that even exceptional skill had limits. He gestured toward the rifle with a sweep of his hand that granted permission and something more, perhaps absolution for any failure that might follow. Isla returned to her shooting position with movements that had become ritual over the years, each adjustment of her body a step in a process that transformed her from person to instrument. 4,000 yards stretched before her like an accusation, a distance that made the earlier shots seem trivial by comparison. The target at that range was invisible to the naked eye, a theoretical point in space that existed more as mathematical concept than physical reality. Major Broderick had taken over the primary spotting scope, adjusting it to maximum magnification and struggling to acquire the distant target through the heat shimmer that turned the landscape into something liquid and unstable. The general stood beside him, binoculars raised, though at this distance even quality optics could only provide the vaguest suggestion of where the target might be. The entire enterprise felt like an exercise in faith rather than marksmanship. Isla studied the wind flags that marked intervals downrange, watching how they moved in patterns that were never quite synchronized. Wind at 1,000 yards might be calm while wind at 2,000 was gusting hard from the northwest, and somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 yards the air currents were doing things that could only be guessed at based on how the heat shimmer distorted. She was attempting to read chaos and impose order on it through force of will and accumulated experience. The first shot would be pure reconnaissance, a prayer sent downrange to see how the universe responded. She made her calculations based on experience rather than formula, compensating for factors that existed in her muscle memory rather than any manual. The rifle settled into her shoulder with familiar weight, and she let her breathing slow until the spaces between heartbeats felt like geological epochs. The shot cracked out across the range, and Isla watched through the scope as the bullet traced an arc that existed more in her mind than in visible reality. For 0.7 seconds passed before impact, time enough for doubt to creep in at the edges of consciousness, time enough to second-guess every calculation. Captain Drummond's voice came across the radio after a long pause, reporting a miss high and right by approximately 30 yards. 30 yards might as well have been 30 miles at this distance, but the miss told Isla what she needed to know. The wind in the middle distance was stronger than she had estimated, and the bullet drop was more severe than standard ballistics table suggested. She made mental adjustments, shifting her aim point in ways that would have looked arbitrary to anyone who did not understand intuitive mathematics she was performing. Behind her, someone coughed nervously, the sound loud in the tense silence. Specialist Torres was holding her breath without realizing it, her face pale with vicarious stress. Sergeant Voss had his phone up again, recording despite having been told not to, unable to resist documenting what might be a historic moment or spectacular failure. Corporal Hayes was gripping the observation deck railing so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Lieutenant Castellan checked her watch, the gesture mechanical and probably unconscious. 16 minutes until the delegation arrived. 16 minutes until this improvised demonstration would need to transform back into scheduled protocol and diplomatic necessity. The general seemed to have forgotten entirely about the visitors. His complete attention focused on what was happening at the firing line, as if watching Islaw work had reconnected him to something he thought he had lost. Islaw's second shot followed her recalculations, adjusted for the wind pattern she had inferred from the first miss, and compensating for what she now understood about how this particular rifle and ammunition performed at extreme range. The bullet flew, and again that eternal 4.7 seconds stretched out like taffy, like time itself had become negotiable. Captain Drummond's voice crackled over the radio with another miss, but this one was closer, high and left by perhaps 15 yards. The corrections were working. The chaos was yielding to pattern. Islaw made her final adjustments, her mind processing variables that existed in dimensions most people never considered. Coriolis effect from the Earth's rotation. Density altitude from a morning's warming temperature. Spin drift from the rifle's barrel twist rate. Factors that were negligible at normal distances, but became critical when pushing the absolute limits of what ballistics could achieve. She settled into her final breathing pattern, feeling her heart rate drop into the zone where physiological noise fell away and left only signal. The rifle was an extension of her intention now, metal and physics waiting to translate will into reality. The general had moved closer without her noticing, standing just behind her right shoulder, silent witness to this moment of truth. The moment before Islaw fired stretched into eternity, a pocket of suspended time where everything that mattered distilled down to breath and trigger and trajectory. Her finger applied pressure so gradually that there was no single instant when the rifle discharged, only the sudden crack of physics being released into the world. The recoil pushed against her shoulder, familiar and grounding, and then came the waiting. 4.7 seconds was both an eternity and an instant. Islaw remained perfectly still, watching through the scope even though there was nothing to see, tracking a bullet that had already passed beyond her ability to influence or observe. Major Broderick was frozen at the spotting scope, his breathing suspended. The general stood motionless, binoculars raised, but likely seeing nothing but heat shimmer and hope. Captain Drummond's voice broke the silence with a single word that carried the weight of revelation. Hit. The word hung in the air for a heartbeat before its meaning fully registered, and then the observation deck erupted. Specialist Torres let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob. Sergeant Voss dropped his phone, the device clattering against the wooden deck, forgotten in his shock. Corporal Hayes actually stumbled backward, as if the confirmation had physically struck him. Even Major Broderick, a man trained to maintain composure under fire, allowed himself a sharp exhale that sounded like he had been holding his breath for hours. The general lowered his binoculars slowly, his weathered face cycling through expressions too complex to name. There was vindication there, certainly the satisfaction of knowing that his challenge had produced something extraordinary. But there was also humility, the recognition that he had just witnessed capabilities that far exceeded his own and perhaps exceeded anything he had imagined possible outside of classified briefing rooms. Islaw sat up from her shooting position, her movements economical and unhurried. The adrenaline that might have flooded another shooter's system seemed absent from her, as if hitting targets at impossible distances was merely routine rather than remarkable. She safed the rifle with practiced efficiency and set it carefully back on its rest before standing and brushing dust from her uniform. Lieutenant Castellan had abandoned her tablet entirely and was staring with the kind of expression usually reserved for witnessing miracles or natural disasters. The young officer's professional composure had cracked, revealing the human being beneath who was struggling to reconcile what she had just seen with her understanding of what was possible. Her lips moved silently, perhaps calculating the probability of what had just occurred, perhaps simply searching for words adequate to the moment. Major Broderick stepped away from the spotting scope and extended his hand toward Isla, a gesture that carried more weight than a simple handshake. When she accepted it, his grip was firm but not crushing, and his eyes held a respect that went beyond rank or protocol. "Corporal Thorne," he said, and his voice carried the sincerity of someone who understood they had just witnessed something that would become legend. "That was the finest shooting I have seen in 23 years of service." Isla nodded her acknowledgement, but said nothing. Words felt inadequate to the moment, and she had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the most eloquent response. The general approached, and the soldiers around them instinctively stepped back, creating space for what felt like a private moment despite the dozen witnesses. "Sir," Isla said, offering a salute that he returned with precision that spoke to decades of habit. The general studied her face for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice carried none of the bluster or frustration that had marked the morning's beginning. "I have had the privilege of serving alongside some of the finest marksmen this country has produced, Corporal. Operators whose names appear in no public record, whose actions saved lives that will never know their debt. I recognize that caliber when I see it." Isla held his gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying what his words implied. Her service record would remain classified. Her operations would continue to exist in the spaces between official acknowledgement. But in this moment, the general was offering something more valuable than recognition. He was offering understanding, the acknowledgement from one professional to another that some things did not need to be spoken to be known. Sergeant Voss had retrieved his phone and was staring at the screen with an expression of disbelief, likely reviewing the footage he had captured and struggling to believe it was real. Corporal Hayes was shaking his head slowly, a gesture that seemed involuntary, as if his brain was still processing the disconnect between his initial mockery and the reality he had just witnessed. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the moment, gravel crunching under tires as the visiting delegation arrived exactly on schedule. Captain Drummond glanced toward the access road and then back at the general, clearly uncertain how to proceed. The morning's demonstration had gone so far off script that there was no protocol for what came next. The delegation emerged from 3 black SUVs with the careful formality of diplomatic protocol, a mix of foreign officers whose uniforms carried the insignia of allied nations and American brass, whose presence suggested this visit carried more weight than a simple training demonstration. The general straightened his uniform with automatic gesture, his earlier frustration replaced by something that looked almost like satisfaction. He had a story to tell now, something far more impressive than the scripted demonstration they had planned. Major Broderick moved quickly to intercept Captain Drummond, their hurried conversation punctuated by glances toward Isla and gestures toward the targets downrange. Isla could see Drummond's resistance giving way to pragmatic acceptance that the morning's unplanned events were now the only story worth telling. He nodded once, sharply, and began walking toward the arriving delegation with the bearing of someone about to improvise on a grand scale. Lieutenant Castellan appeared at Isla's elbow, her tablet now functioning as a shield again, though her voice carried none of its earlier professional distance. "They're going to want to know who you are," she said quietly. "The general will need some kind of brief he can share without violating classification protocols." Isla understood the problem. Her existence was classified, but her performance had been witnessed by too many people to simply disappear or dismiss. The diplomatic visitors would ask questions, and those questions would require answers that threaded the needle between truth and operational security. She had navigated similar situations before, usually with the support of handlers and carefully prepared cover stories, but this had been spontaneous and unrehearsed. "Tell them I am a training cadre member temporarily assigned to Fort Redstone," she said. "Specialty in long-range marksmanship instruction. That is technically true and requires no clearance to confirm." Castellan nodded and made notes on her tablet, her fingers moving with the speed of someone grateful to have concrete action to focus on. Isla watched the delegation approach, noting their body language and the way their eyes swept across the range with professional assessment. These were people who understood military capabilities and would recognize excellence when it was demonstrated. The challenge would be satisfying their curiosity without revealing details that remained protected. Specialist Torres had moved to join the other junior enlisted personnel who were now scrambling to restore some semblance of the planned demonstration setup. The young woman kept glancing back toward Isla with an expression that mixed awe and confusion, as if trying to reconcile the unremarkable corporal she had seen earlier with the person who had just accomplished something that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Sergeant Voss had secured his phone and was now standing at rigid attention as the delegation passed, his earlier casual demeanor replaced by textbook military bearing. Corporal Hayes had done the same, though his eyes tracked Isla's position with an intensity that suggested he was still processing what he had witnessed. The mockery that had colored his earlier comments had been thoroughly cremated by 4,000 yards of demonstrated competence. The general led the delegation toward the observation deck, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air as he began to narrate what had transpired. Isla caught fragments of his explanation, phrases like exceptional marksmanship, an unprecedented demonstration, and elite capabilities that were carefully vague while suggesting significance. The foreign officers listened with expressions that cycled between professional interest and genuine surprise. A British colonel, his uniform bearing the insignia of the Royal Marines, broke away from the main group and approached the spotting scope that Major Broderick had been using. He peered through it toward the distant target, adjusted the focus, and then straightened with a low whistle that needed no translation. He turned toward Isla, his gaze sharp and assessing, carrying the recognition of someone who understood exactly how difficult what she had accomplished truly was. Major Broderick gestured for Isla to join them, and she moved forward with the same unhurried pace that had characterized all her actions that morning. The delegation parted slightly as she approached, creating a space that felt both welcoming and evaluative. The general made introductions with the smooth efficiency of someone who had spent decades in diplomatic circles, introducing Isla as Corporal Thorne, one of our specialized training instructors. The British colonel extended his hand, and his grip when she accepted it was firm without being challenging. "Remarkable shooting, Corporal," he said, his accent carrying the clipped precision of someone educated at prestigious military academies. "I have had the privilege of working with some of the finest snipers in the Commonwealth, and what you have just demonstrated ranks among the most impressive marksmanship I have witnessed." Isla accepted the compliment with a slight nod, aware that every word she spoke would be analyzed and remembered. "The conditions were favorable, sir," she said, deflecting credit in the way that operators were trained to do. "The rifle is excellent, and the range provided adequate distance for a proper demonstration." The general's expression suggested he appreciated her modesty even if he did not quite believe it. A French officer, a woman whose rank insignia identified her as a lieutenant colonel, asked a technical question about wind compensation at extreme range, and Isla answered with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly where the line between shareable knowledge and classified methodology existed. The demonstration that followed Isla's performance felt almost anticlimactic, though the delegation remained professionally engaged as various Fort Redstone personnel showcased their skills at more conventional distances. The general had recovered his composure entirely and moved through the scripted presentations with renewed confidence. But everyone present understood that the morning's real story had already been written in a three-shot sequence that had defied probability. Isla had been quietly dismissed back to the observation deck, where she stood in the same position she had occupied at the beginning of the morning, once again holding a cup of coffee that would grow cold before she remembered to drink it. The difference was that now every pair of eyes on the range seemed magnetically drawn to her position, stealing glances when they thought she would not notice, whispering conversations that stopped abruptly when she moved. Specialist Torres approached with the hesitant steps of someone who had built up courage over multiple failed attempts. She stopped a respectful distance away and stood at awkward attention until Isla turned to acknowledge her. The young woman's face was flushed, her words tumbling out in a rush that suggested they had been rehearsed but were now escaping in chaotic order. Corporal, I just wanted to say that what you did was incredible, and I am sorry if I seemed dismissive earlier, and I have never seen anything like that, and I just wanted you to know that it was amazing to witness. Isla studied the specialist for a moment, seeing in her earnest expression the reflection of her own younger self. Back when everything in the military had seemed larger than life, and every demonstration of skill had carried the weight of revelation. She softened her typically neutral expression into something approaching warmth. You have nothing to apologize for, specialist. What happened this morning was outside normal parameters. Your reaction was appropriate to the situation as you understood it. Torres seemed to deflate with relief, her rigid posture relaxing into something more natural. She hesitated, clearly wanting to ask questions that Isla would not be able to answer, then settled for a simple thank you before retreating back to her assigned duties. Isla watched her go and felt the familiar weight of being simultaneously visible and invisible, known and unknown. Sergeant Voss and Corporal Hayes maintained a careful distance, though their glances carried none of the earlier mockery. Hayes in particular looked like someone wrestling with shame, his earlier comments about the morning being entertaining now revealed as profound underestimation. Voss had transferred his phone footage to a secure device and was now guarding it like classified material, perhaps understanding that what he had captured was the kind of moment that would be discussed in military circles for years. Major Broderick separated from the delegation and made his way back to where Isla stood, his expression thoughtful. "The general has asked me to arrange a private meeting with you later this afternoon," he said quietly. "He wants to discuss your current assignment and potential reassignment to positions that might better utilize your capabilities." Isla had expected this. Exceptional performance always drew attention, and attention led to offers and opportunities that could be as much burden as benefit. She nodded her acceptance while internally calculating how this would affect the carefully constructed obscurity she had been maintaining. Administrative assignments were comfortable precisely because they demanded nothing, allowed her to exist in the spaces between operations without constant pressure or scrutiny. Major Broderick seemed to sense her hesitation. He leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to ensure privacy. "Between us, Corporal, I think he wants to apologize. Not officially, not in any way that would appear in records, but man to man. Or in this case, soldier to soldier. This morning reminded him of something he thought he had lost, and you were the mirror that showed him both what he used to be and what he no longer is." The insight surprised Isla with its depth and accuracy. She studied the Major's face and saw genuine respect there, untainted by the posturing or politics that often characterized interactions between ranks. He understood that this morning had been about more than marksmanship, that it had been about identity and capability and the stories people told themselves about who they were. "I will be there, sir," Isla said simply. The delegation began moving toward their vehicles. The official demonstration concluded, their schedules demanding they move on to the next item on their carefully planned itinerary. The British colonel paused before entering his SUV and offered Isla a salute that carried the weight of professional recognition between equals. She returned it with the same precision, a moment of mutual respect that transcended national boundaries and rank structures. As the vehicles departed, trailing dust clouds that hung in the still morning air, the atmosphere on the range began to shift. Soldiers who had been holding themselves in formal postures relaxed incrementally. Conversations resumed at normal volume, and the tension that had gripped the morning began to dissipate like morning fog under sun. But the memory of what had happened would not fade so easily. Captain Drummond approached the general, and their conversation appeared animated, punctuated by gestures toward the distant targets and occasional glances in Isla's direction. She could not hear their words, but she understood their substance. They were discussing how to document what had occurred, how to explain it in official reports without revealing information that remained protected, how to navigate the bureaucratic requirements while respecting operational security. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the general's office, casting long shadows across the military memorabilia that decorated the walls. Isla sat in the chair across from his desk, her posture relaxed but alert, while the general poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher that probably dated back to the Cold War. He handed her one and settled into his own chair with the careful movements of someone whose body remembered too many jumps and force marches. "I wanted to thank you, Corporal Thorne," he said without preamble, "not just for the demonstration, though that was extraordinary, but for reminding an old soldier that excellence still exists in this army, that somewhere beneath all the paperwork and politics, we still produce warriors who can do impossible things." Isla took a sip of water, considering her response. "You're not as far from that excellence as you believe, sir. This morning your struggle was mental, not physical. The skills are still there. They simply need the right conditions to emerge." The general smiled, a genuine expression that softened the hard lines of his face. "You're diplomatic as well as skilled. That is a rare combination." He paused, then continued with more weight in his voice. "I have made some calls this afternoon. Your next assignment, when it comes through, will reflect capabilities that better match your training. No more administrative limbo." Isla had expected this, but hearing it confirmed brought a complex mixture of relief and resignation. Administrative assignments have been restful precisely because they demanded nothing extraordinary, allowed her to exist without the constant pressure of life and death decisions. But she also understood that skills like hers were resources that could not be left idle indefinitely, that somewhere in the world there would always be another mission that required someone willing to take impossible shots. "I appreciate that, sir," she said simply. The general leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "Major Broderick told me about your conversation with Specialist Torres. That was well done. That young soldier will remember this morning for the rest of her career, and your kindness will be part of that memory. Leadership is not always about rank or orders. Sometimes it is about showing junior personnel that excellence does not require arrogance." The observation surprised Isla with its insight. She had not thought of her interaction with Torres as leadership, had simply responded with the same patience she wished someone had shown her years ago when she was young and uncertain. But perhaps that was what leadership actually looked like at its foundation. Small moments of recognition and respect that accumulated into culture and example. "Word has already spread across the base," the general continued. "By this evening, every soldier at Fort Redstone will know some version of what happened this morning. Most of those versions will be exaggerated, of course. By next week, you will have supposedly hit targets at 6,000 yards while blindfolded during a hurricane." Isla allowed herself a small smile. Military legend had a way of transforming facts into mythology, and she had seen her own actions distorted through that lens before. The truth was impressive enough, but human nature demanded embellishment, needed stories that could be told and retold until they became part of collective identity. The general stood and moved to his window, looking out across Fort Redstone's grounds where soldiers moved through their afternoon routines. "I spent this morning being reminded of my limitations," he said quietly. "It was not pleasant, but it was necessary. We tell ourselves stories about who we are, and sometimes those stories need updating. I am no longer the marksman I once was, and that is acceptable because my role now is different." He turned back to face Isla, and his expression carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "But I'm grateful that I was reminded there are still soldiers like you out there, still people who can do the things they used to do and do them even better. The mission continues even when individual capability fades, and that is as it should be." If this story moved you, drop a comment about your favorite moment, or share if you have ever witnessed someone reveal unexpected abilities that completely change how others saw them. Maybe you know someone who showed hidden strength when it mattered most. Isla stood and came to attention, recognizing that their conversation had reached its natural conclusion. The general returned her salute with the crispness of someone who had performed the gesture thousands of times, and there was mutual respect in the exchange that transcended the simple formality. As she left his office and walked back across the base, Isla felt the weight of eyes following her progress. Soldiers she did not know offered nods of acknowledgement. Officers whose names she had never learned gave respectful greetings. The invisibility she had cultivated so carefully had been stripped away by 4,000 yards of demonstrated competence, and she would need to adapt to this new reality. Specialist Torres appeared from the mess hall and waved enthusiastically, her earlier nervousness replaced by something approaching pride, as if Isla's performance had somehow reflected on her by proximity. Sergeant Voss and Corporal Hayes stood near the motor pool, and when they saw her approaching, both men straightened and offered salutes that carried genuine respect rather than obligation. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Isla paused for a moment, allowing herself to simply exist in this space between assignments, this brief window where she was neither invisible nor deployed, neither forgotten nor essential. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and eventually new orders, but for now she could simply be Corporal Isla Thorne, a soldier who had reminded a general and herself that excellence was not lost, merely waiting for the right moment to emerge.